The Galactic Empire arrived above Earth with engines roaring and banners of conquest. They called it a primitive world, a blue sphere, spinning quietly in the dark, but the admirals saw the readings, the strange surge beneath the old forests, the pulse of something ancient and powerful that could fuel their dying suns. So they sent the Imperial scouts down in black ships that cut the clouds like knives. The people of Earth watched from behind trees and rooftops as the ships roared over the rivers and mountains, the soldiers stepping out in shining armor that glowed under the gray sky. The Empire thought it was just another harvest, another conquest. They did not see the way the crows circled over the forest, watching them with cold, bright eyes. They did not feel the way the wind slowed near the edge of the black forest, where the shadows hung heavy like waiting breath. They moved with scanners humming, searching for the energy. The reports spoke of a strange beacon that twisted their instruments, a flicker of something they could not name hidden in the deep green. The scouts pushed forward, stomping over moss and breaking branches. As they joked about the primitives and the stories of witches they heard from the Outer Rim traders, the captain of the scouts was a man who had burned cities before, who had dragged prisoners by their hair, and who had watched entire continents fall to ash beneath the Empire fleet. He was not afraid of trees or stories. He walked ahead with a blaster on his hip and a scanner in his hand, ignoring the cold that wrapped around his neck like a breath. As he found the clearing, and there it stood, a small, crooked hut, perched on giant chicken legs, walking slowly in a circle around a ring of stones, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin gray line. The hut paused as the scouts stepped closer, its legs bending as if listening to the earth, the windows glowing faintly like eyes in the dusk. The captain laughed and pointed his scanner at it, telling the others to record the structure for the Empire archives. He called it a primitive shrine, maybe a relic, maybe a source of the anomaly they were tracking. He did not see the crows landing on the branches above. Silent as they watched, he did not see the shadows pulling themselves together near the steps of the hut, forming the shape of an old woman with bones tied into her hair, and a gaze that cut through the captain like a blade. The scouts raised their blasters when they saw her stepping down from the air itself, as if she had been there forever, waiting, her eyes cold and endless like the dark between the stars. The captain barked a command, telling her to identify herself, telling her to kneel before the Empire, telling her they would take what they wanted, as they always did. She tilted her head, watching him with a small smile, her fingers crackling with a dark spark. The crows shifted on the branches. Silent as the forest itself, the scouts felt the cold bite deeper, felt the air thicken around them like the silence before a storm. They did not understand what they had found in this clearing. They did not understand who they had disturbed. The Galactic Empire arrived above Earth with engines roaring and banners of conquest. They called it a primitive world, a blue sphere, spinning quietly in the dark, but the admirals saw the readings, the strange surge beneath the old forests, the pulse of something ancient and powerful that could fuel their dying suns. So they sent the Imperial scouts down in black ships that cut the clouds like knives. The people of Earth watched from behind trees and rooftops as the ships roared over the rivers and mountains, the soldiers stepping out in shining armor that glowed under the gray sky. The Empire thought it was just another harvest, another conquest. They did not see the way the crows circled over the forest, watching them with cold, bright eyes. They did not feel the way the wind slowed near the edge of the black forest, where the shadows hung heavy like waiting breath. They moved with scanners humming, searching for the energy. The reports spoke of a strange beacon that twisted their instruments, a flicker of something they could not name hidden in the deep green. The scouts pushed forward, stomping over moss and breaking branches. As they joked about the primitives and the stories of witches they heard from the Outer Rim traders, the captain of the scouts was a man who had burned cities before, who had dragged prisoners by their hair, and who had watched entire continents fall to ash beneath the Empire fleet. He was not afraid of trees or stories. He walked ahead with a blaster on his hip and a scanner in his hand, ignoring the cold that wrapped around his neck like a breath. As he found the clearing, and there it stood, a small, crooked hut, perched on giant chicken legs, walking slowly in a circle around a ring of stones, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin gray line. The hut paused as the scouts stepped closer, its legs bending as if listening to the earth, the windows glowing faintly like eyes in the dusk. The captain laughed and pointed his scanner at it, telling the others to record the structure for the Empire archives. He called it a primitive shrine, maybe a relic, maybe a source of the anomaly they were tracking. He did not see the crows landing on the branches above. Silent as they watched, he did not see the shadows pulling themselves together near the steps of the hut, forming the shape of an old woman with bones tied into her hair, and a gaze that cut through the captain like a blade. The scouts raised their blasters when they saw her stepping down from the air itself, as if she had been there forever, waiting, her eyes cold and endless like the dark between the stars. The captain barked a command, telling her to identify herself, telling her to kneel before the Empire, telling her they would take what they wanted as they always did. She tilted her head, watching him with a small smile, her fingers crackling with a dark spark. The crows shifted on the branches. Silent as the forest itself, the scouts felt the cold bite deeper, felt the air thicken around them like the silence before a storm. They did not understand what they had found in this clearing. They did not understand who they had disturbed. Baba Yaga stepped out from the shadows that clung to her like old friends, her hair tangled with bones, her eyes deep with the dark of ancient nights. Her fingers curled as if holding winds and storms in her palms. She looked at the Empire soldiers, standing in their bright armor with their blasters humming, and she saw how small they truly were. The captain raised his blaster, telling her again that she was under arrest, telling her to surrender or be destroyed, and the soldiers shifted nervously, feeling the cold air press against their helmets. The forest seemed to lean in closer. The branches, heavy with watching crows, the hut on chicken legs, took a single step backward as if to give her space. As she lifted her hand, the wind twisted around, her fingers like silver threads. The soldiers aimed their weapons, but the scanners flickered again, showing them that the anomaly was coming from her chest, from her hands, from her eyes. The captain shouted a command and the soldiers opened fire, blasters lighting up the dusk in red and blue streaks that cracked through the air, but the shots bent around her, falling into the moss, hissing like dying serpents. She watched them calmly, stepping forward as if walking through a soft rain. The crows lifted into the air, circling above her as the forest seemed to breathe with each step she took. The soldiers began to panic, shouting about shields not working and energy readings spiking, and something about the scanners screaming warnings. They did not understand. She looked at them, and the blasters fell silent, the lights on the weapons blinking and dying one by one, leaving them holding dead metal and shaking hands. The captain tried to call for backup, his communicator lighting up with static, his voice echoing in the empty channel as he demanded air support, demanded orbital strikes, demanded something, anything, but the sky remained still, and the Empire ships in orbit gave no answer. She told them again they had 2 days to leave, to take their cold metal and their empty threats back to their stars, or she would come for them. She told them she was older than their empire, older than the empires before them and the empires before those. She told them that the forest was patient but not forgiving. The captain stepped back, fear creeping into his eyes as he tried to keep his voice steady, telling her she would regret this, telling her the empire would burn her forest and her world to ash, telling her that they would take what they wanted. She looked at him with eyes like winter rivers and told him softly that nothing they built would stand if they broke the promise she was giving them now. She turned away, stepping back toward her hut, and the shadows gathered around her as if to shield her from their gaze. The crows landed again on the branches, watching the soldiers as the forest fell silent. The hut turned and walked slowly back into the trees, its legs bending carefully with each step, the light in the windows blinking once like an eye closing. The soldiers stood there in the clearing, the smell of burnt moss in the air, their weapons dead, their hearts pounding as they realized the forest was watching and listening and waiting. The soldiers returned to their ship with the forest watching them with cold, silent eyes. The captain paced in the command bay, shouting at his officers, demanding that they contact the orbiting fleet, demanding air support, demanding orbital bombardment. But the comm screens flickered with static and cold light, showing nothing but the empty channels and the hiss of silence. The crew tried to reroute signals to the high orbit relay towers, but the signals bent and twisted, showing ghost images of the forest below, showing flickers of the hut walking between trees and the crows circling as if the sky itself was made of wings. The captain screamed at the engineers to fix the systems, to clear the channels, to call down the wrath of the Empire, to burn the forest and its witch and take the energy they came for. But the systems glitched, showing images of the old woman with bones in her hair, her eyes like cold rivers staring back at them from every console screen. The soldiers who had seen her stood in silence, unable to speak, as they remembered how the blaster fire bent away from her, how the air grew heavy around them, How the shadows seemed to pull closer with every breath. The captain hit the console with his fist, shouting that he would not leave, that the Empire did not retreat, that they would crush this witch and take what was theirs, because the Empire always took what it wanted. The crows landed on the ship rails and on the landing struts, their eyes bright as they watched the soldiers move crates of weapons and power cells, preparing for an assault, preparing to set fire to the forest and flush out the witch with flamers and sonic charges. The engineers tried to reroute power to the scanners to find her, to trace the anomaly that pulsed through the forest like a heartbeat, but every time they locked onto the signal, it moved it, shifted it, turned into the wind itself, slipping through their instruments like smoke. The captain ordered the troops to move out to sweep the forest and burn it to ash. They moved in tight formations with heavy flamers at the front and sonic displacers humming in the dusk. The crows flew ahead of them, disappearing into the dark trees as the soldiers pushed into the forest. With the smell of oil and burning resin around them, the forest did not move, the trees stood silent, and the moss swallowed their steps. The sound of their boots muffled by the green beneath them. The crows watched from the branches above, silent, black eyes reflecting the glow of the flamer coils. The captain shouted for the witch to come out, shouted that the Empire was here, and that it would not leave, shouted that he would tear down the forest and drag her out by her hair. But there was only the wind moving through the leaves like a cold breath, and the hush of the forest that felt like it was waiting for something. The soldiers began to feel the weight of the silence pressing on their helmets, pressing on their chests, the sound of their own breathing loud in their ears as they stepped deeper into the green. The scanners flickered, showing shapes between the trees, shapes that moved with the wind, shapes that watched with cold, bright eyes. The captain kept shouting as the shadows thickened around them, as the crows circled above them, and the forest began to close. The forest closed around the soldiers as they moved deeper with their flamers ready, and the sonic displacers humming a low whine that made the birds fall silent. The crows followed them from above, black wings flashing between branches, their eyes cold as they watched the Empire march forward. The captain barked orders to keep moving, to sweep the sectors, to find the witch and drag her out, but every step felt heavier as the moss pulled at their boots and the roots seemed to twist beneath the soil like slow serpents. The air grew colder as they moved further into the green, the dusk thickening around them like a veil, and the scanners began to show the anomaly pulsing just ahead, always just out of reach. The soldiers grew restless as they fired the flamers at the trees, the fire catching on old bark and moss, sending smoke curling up, but the flames died quickly, as if the forest swallowed them, leaving nothing but ash. The captain shouted for them to keep burning, to push forward, to clear the path, but the path was never clear. The trees moved closer, the branches bending over their heads, blocking the gray sky. The crows circled lower now, so close that the soldiers could hear the rustle of wings as they passed overhead. The sonic displacers began to glitch, their hum rising and falling like a dying breath. The engineers tapped the controls, trying to stabilize the frequency, but the devices began to spark and the hum turned into a low scream that echoed through the helmets of the soldiers. The captain ripped the displacer from the engineer's hands, throwing it to the ground as it sparked and hissed. The soldiers tightened their formation, their blasters up, eyes scanning the shadows that thickened around them. The forest seemed alive, the leaves shivering without wind, the branches moving like slow fingers, the moss swallowing the ash from the burned trees as if erasing the Empire's touch. The crows landed on the branches just above the captain, their eyes locked on him, unblinking as he raised his blaster toward the darkness. The scanners flickered, and for a moment, they all saw her standing between the trees, her hair tangled with bones, her eyes cold and endless, her hands lifted as if holding the wind itself. The soldiers opened fire, the blasters lighting up the dusk with blue streaks that cracked through the cold air, but the shots bent away, falling into the moss and the shadows. Without a sound, the forest absorbed the light, the fire, the fury of the Empire, and gave nothing back. The captain screamed at her, demanding that she stop, demanding that she surrender, demanding that she bow to the Empire. And the crows lifted into the air as the forest fell silent. The witch stepped forward, slowly, her bare feet touching the moss without a sound, her eyes fixed on the captain, as if she saw every moment of his life. Every fear he carried, every breath he took. She told him softly that the Empire had broken its chance, that the 2 days were not yet over. But he had chosen the path of ash and shadow. She told him that the forest would not forget and the stars would remember what they did here. And she lifted her hand and the wind roared through the trees. The wind roared through the trees as if the forest had opened its lungs to speak, and the sound was like 1,000 rivers crashing over rocks, like the breath of mountains, like the cry of old gods. The soldiers staggered as the wind hit them, tearing at their armor, shaking their weapons, pulling at their helmets. The crows rose in a black wave above them, circling and diving with eyes like cold stars. The witch stood with her hand lifted, the shadows wrapping around her like a cloak, as the wind twisted around her fingers like smoke. The captain shouted orders, his voice lost in the roar as he tried to hold his ground, aiming his blaster with shaking hands as the scanner on his wrist flickered with warnings of power surges and gravitational anomalies. The soldiers tried to form a line, but the roots burst from the ground thick and wet, twisting around their boots, pulling them to the moss. The forest swallowed their screams as they fell. The flamers dropped from their hands, hissing as they were crushed by the roots. The sonic displacers exploded in sparks as the frequencies collided with the hum of the forest. The crows flew lower, darting between branches, watching the soldiers with sharp eyes as the witch stepped forward, her bare feet touching the moss that opened to let her pass. The captain tried to fire, but the blaster clicked empty. The energy drained into the ground. His visor showed her face close. Now her eyes, endless and cold as they looked into him, seeing everything he had done, every city, burned every prisoner, silenced every child, taken by the Empire, and she tilted her head and the roots pulled him to his knees. The wind stopped all at once, leaving a heavy silence. The only sound was the shaking breaths of the soldiers and the soft rustle of crows' wings as they landed on the branches around them. The witch looked at the captain and told him softly that he had been warned, that the Empire had been given 2 days to leave, but they chose to break. The forest chose to bring fire and noise to a place that only asked to be left in peace. The captain tried to speak, but the roots tightened around his chest, stealing his breath as he looked up at her. The crows landed near his feet, their eyes watching his face as if they could see the moment his fear turned into understanding. The witch told him that the Empire thought it was eternal, thought it was above the laws of earth and stars, thought it could take what it wanted without consequence. But the forest remembered, and the wind remembered, and the bones in her hair remembered. The hut appeared behind her, walking on its chicken legs, the windows glowing softly in the dusk, the door opening like a waiting mouth. The witch turned and walked toward it, leaving the captain kneeling with the roots holding him. As the soldiers watched in silence, unable to move, unable to speak, the crows lifted into the air again, and the forest exhaled a cold breath that swept through the trees as the hut turned and stepped back into the darkness, and the witch whispered that the Empire had 1 day left and the stars would remember. Night fell heavy over the forest as the soldiers struggled in the roots that held them, the crows watching with cold bright eyes, the wind whispering through the branches like an old song. The hut, with its chicken legs, moved through the trees, its windows flickering with a pale light as it disappeared into the dark. The witch gone with it, leaving only the silence and the cold and the fear pressing down on the Empire soldiers. The captain tried to command them, tried to speak orders into the come, but the words fell from his lips like broken glass. The soldiers looked at him with wide eyes, their armor scratched, their weapons drained. The scanners dead on their wrists, they felt the forest watching them, the moss shifting under their knees, the roots pulsing with a slow heartbeat. The captain told them to get up, to cut themselves free, to form ranks, but the roots only tightened, holding them to the earth that would not let them go. The crows moved closer, hopping on the moss near their hands, near their boots, near their faces, with heads tilted as if listening to the fear that filled the air above the trees. The Empire ships hovered silent, their engines humming, as the pilots tried to get clear readings, tried to contact the fleet above, but the screens showed only static and the faces of the crew in pale reflection. The scanners showed the forest as a single living thing, its energy readings spiking and fading like breath. The pilots argued about leaving, about calling for help, about dropping fire on the forest to burn it clear, but the weapons systems failed to lock. The targeting arrays spun in circles, unable to find coordinates. The forest was there, but it was not there. It was under them, and around them, and inside every system they had. The captain screamed into the com, demanding air support, demanding orbital strikes, demanding to speak to the fleet, but the fleet did not answer. Only the whisper of static and the flicker of shadows on the screens. The soldiers in the forest felt the cold pressing closer as the moon rose above the trees, casting a pale light that turned the moss silver. The crows flew up again, in a single wave of black wings, circling the soldiers as they struggled. The roots loosened, just enough for them to rise shaking as they lifted their dead weapons and tried to form lines. The captain told them to prepare to move, to find the witch, to take her and force her to end Whatever curse she had put on them, he told them the empire would not be defeated by an old woman in a forest on a backward world. The soldiers moved, but the forest moved with them, the trees shifting the branches, bending the moss, swallowing their steps, the crows following silently as the soldiers pushed deeper into the dark, looking for the glow of the hut, looking for the witch with bones in her hair, looking for something they could shoot or burn, or take to make the fear go away. But the forest gave them nothing, only the whisper of the wind and the soft, cold light of the moon as it watched them from above, and somewhere far in the dark, the hut walked slowly, and the witch waited, and the day was almost gone. The dawn came cold and gray over the forest, the fog rolling between the trees like slow breath. The soldiers moved through the mist, their boots sinking into the wet moss, their weapons dead in their hands, their scanners showing only flickers of movement that vanished when they turned to look. The captain moved at the front, his armor scratched, his eyes red from sleepless fear, as he whispered to himself that the empire would not fall here, that they would take the witch, that they would take the power of the forest, that they would not leave empty-handed. The crows watched from the branches above, silent and still, as the soldiers moved under them, the mist curling around their legs. Like cold fingers, the soldiers flinched at every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every shadow that moved in the corner of their eyes. They were empire soldiers. They had burned cities. They had silenced planets. They had crushed rebellions, but here in this forest, with the cold breath of dawn on their necks, they felt smaller than they had ever felt. The captain raised his hand as he saw it through the fog. The hut standing on its chicken legs, its windows glowing softly like tired eyes. Watching them, the soldiers lifted their weapons. Out of reflex, even though the weapons were empty, the scanners flickered and died as they stepped closer. The ground felt alive under their boots, pulsing with a soft rhythm that matched the beating of their hearts. The door of the hut creaked open, slowly, and the witch stepped out, her hair tangled with bones, her eyes calm and cold as she looked at them. She stepped down onto the moss, the ground lifting to meet her feet as she walked. Toward them, the crows lifted into the air, circling above her. As the forest fell silent, the captain raised his blaster, his hands shaking, as he screamed at her to stop, to surrender, to give the empire what it came for. She looked at him, and the soldiers saw something in her eyes, something older than the empire, older than the stars, older than the dark between worlds. She told them the time was over, that the 2 days had passed, that the forest had been patient, that the crows had waited, that the roots had listened, and that now the empire would see what it meant to take what was not theirs. The ground shook softly as the roots began to rise from the moss, thick and dark, twisting around the legs of the soldiers, pulling at them, dragging them down. The crows flew lower, screaming into the dawn. As the witch lifted her hand, the wind roaring through the trees, the hut stepped back, slowly turning toward the deeper forest, its windows blinking once like tired eyes. The soldiers screamed as the roots dragged them down into the moss, the forest, swallowing their cries as the crows circled above. The captain tried to break free, tried to lift his blaster, but the roots pulled it from his hands as the witch stepped closer, her eyes reflecting the dawn light like cold water. She told him softly that the empire would be forgotten here, that the forest would remember, that the stars would remember, and the wind would carry their names away like dust. The wind roared one last time through the trees as the dawn broke fully over the forest, cold light pouring over the moss and the roots that twisted and pulled the empire soldiers into the earth. The crows circled above in black waves, their wings cutting the morning air like whispers of old stories. The witch stood with her hand lifted, her hair tangled with bones, her eyes reflecting the pale light as she watched the empire break before her. The captain screamed as the roots dragged him down the moss, swallowing his legs, his arms, his chest, until only his face remained, staring at the sky that would never see his fleet again. He shouted that the empire would come for her, that they would send more ships, that they would burn this world and crush the forest and tear down the witch and scatter her bones to the void. But the witch stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the moss as the crows landed around her, watching with cold bright eyes, and she told him that the empire was already gone, that the empire had already been forgotten, that the empire was nothing in the eyes of the forest, that the crows would carry the memory of this place to the winds, and the winds tell the stars, and the stars would remember that here the empire came and here the empire ended. The hut stepped out of the trees, its legs bending as it knelt low to the ground, the windows blinking softly like eyes that had seen centuries. The door opened and the witch turned and stepped inside. The crows lifted into the sky, following the hut as it stood, and began to walk back into the forest, the trees parting for it, the moss closing behind it, the roots slowly sinking back into the earth as the last screams of the empire soldiers fell silent. The captain tried to lift his head, but the moss pulled him down, the cold wet earth pressing against his face as he saw the last glimpse of the hut. Walking away, the witch looking back at him one last time, her eyes calm and endless. Before the forest swallowed her, the wind fell silent and the forest stood still. The crows vanished into the trees and the moss covered the ground as if nothing had happened, as if the Empire had never been there, as if the blasters and scanners and cold metal boots had never touched the soil above the forest. The Empire ships in orbit flickered on the scanners, and then the scanners went dark, one by one, the ships drifting in silence as the systems failed, as the energy was drained, as the engines died. The crew aboard those ships stared out of the windows at the world below, unable to speak, unable to move. As the cold silence of the void crept into the halls of the Empire, the forest was quiet, the wind moved softly through the leaves, and the crows watched from the branches. The witch sat in her hut, the bones in her hair whispering softly to her as she sipped her tea. The stars above blinked in the dawn sky, watching and remembering as the Empire that thought it could take what it wanted disappeared from the world, and the forest sighed softly as it returned to its patient waiting, its endless breathing, its deep green dreaming.